Close your eyes and breathe slowly. Let the room soften around the edges and become a shape that holds only you, a small hearth of warmth in a wide and patient dark. Tonight I will tell you a story that moves like a slow comet, patient, inevitable, and full of small glows. It is a story about a light that forgot the way home, and about the way people learn to listen when everything else goes quiet. It began, quietly enough, with a mistake of scale, as so many small revolutions do. In the coastal plain of Portugal, an old radio astronomer named Mateo Oliveira kept a garden of dish antennas that watched the sky like curious cats. Mateo was the kind of man who could sit for 3 nights without sleep, because the universe sometimes speaks in the interval between breaths, and he did not want to miss a single inch of that space. One autumn evening, as a thin fog rolled off the Atlantic and the antennas hummed softly, his receiver registered a note, a sliver of narrow-band light that threaded through the noise like a needle. At first, it seemed like nothing. The pulse was faint, almost apologetic, a single spectral line drifting across frequencies, then gone. Mateo marked it in his log, timestamp, amplitude, frequency. He archived it with a number and a dot of T on the page. He is a careful man. The universe rewards patience the way gardens reward light. The next night, the line returned, a little stronger. The third night it returned again, and this time with a pattern. 4 beats, a pause, then 3, a rhythm that fit into a rhythm, like hands finding each other in the dark. Mateo sent the data to 2 colleagues in different hemispheres. An observatory in Kyoto confirmed the trace, then one in Cape Town. The pattern multiplied like a constellation. The same cadence, transmitted across the vast machines of human curiosity. Scientists called it a transient, a temporary anomaly in the vast sea of sky lore. Social media shrugged. A handful of internet forums spun out theories: pulsar, satellite reflection, a prank by a graduate student with too much time, and a stolen transmitter. But the few researchers who listened with a kind of reverence began to feel something else. The pattern, when stretched and folded, suggested an aligning of times. There was an internal geometry to the beats, not random and not purely physical. It smelled, faintly, of intention. We are untidy listeners most of the time. We have microphones in our pockets that chatter, servers that hum, algorithms that demand attention. In that continuous cloud of noise, the soft, regular voice from the dark should have faded into the background. Instead, it pulled at a small number of human hearts, like a lullaby tugging at the edge of sleep. People began to call the pattern the syllable. The syllable continued for months. It was stubborn, returning with a cadence like a tide. Radio arrays and optical telescopes turned toward its coordinates and found nothing visible. No bright object, no tail, no cometary dust. The signal seemed to emanate from an otherwise empty patch of sky, a place between maps that sat like a door ajar. Attempts to triangulate its location rendered only an impression, a diffuse origin that shimmered and smeared under the influence of interstellar medium, as though some long path had folded and left faint fingerprints. At first, the world treated it as a curiosity. Then it became a kind of companion. Late-night radio hosts played the raw waveforms, and sound artists resampled them into ambient loops that cropped up in playlists for sleeplessness. Lovers sent one another recordings like secret messages. A teacher in Madrid used it as a sound exercise, asking children to clap the rhythm until their hands remembered how to wait. Waiting, it turned out, was its own kind of education. And then, one winter evening, the syllable changed. Not in volume or pitch, but in the meaning hidden behind the pattern. For the first time since Mateo had seen that first thread, the beats arranged themselves into something that looked like numbers. Carefully, slowly, an international team of linguists and physicists arranged the pattern into an emergent code. They discovered a sequence, prime numbers concatenated in a way that hinted at a deliberate marker of intelligence, the sort of basic handshake that the earliest carbon-based machines might make when introducing themselves to a neighbor across a long street of carbon stars. Once suspicion became possibility, possibility became obsession. Telescopes trained, and the world watched with an intensity that felt almost like prayer. People who had never cared for the heavens learned to look up at the right hours, as if timing might allow them to catch a whisper. Governments convened panels, journals printed special issues, and broadcast networks ran features with a voice somewhere between excitable and reverent. We pretended we were calm. Under that pretense, there was hunger. The signal, now deciphered into short packets, began to contain something stranger still. Directions. Not crude coordinates, but vectors that implied movement through time as well as space. They pointed along a curve that, when plotted, matched an object moving on an arc so gentle and vast it could only be described as a ship no one had seen, or as a phenomenon traveling through curved space-time in a way that smoothed out into a slow, deliberate arc. Some of the team argued mathematics, others argued philosophy. Who was sending the message, and to whom did it belong? A few voices insisted on caution. Signals in the void can be deceptive. Pulsars create regularities that mimic intention. Ionospheric reflections can fold a human-made noise into patterns that look like meaning. But more and more of the data resisted these mundane explanations. The syllables mathematics was too clean, too intentional, to be merely the happenstance of cosmic mechanics. Then came the night the lights went out. It was not a spectacular collapse. There were no explosions, no flaring auroras on the horizon. Instead, as if a distant hand had whispered through the planet's spine, a cascade of small things failed. One major satellite network experienced temporary desynchronization. A handful of undersea links suffered brief packet loss. Several radio arrays recorded a sudden rise in background noise, like static swelling under a song. In places where people expected a constant whisper from their devices, there was silence. Phones dimmed, messages failed to send, and for hours, parts of the internet felt as if someone had asked it politely to sleep. The outage lasted long enough to cause inconvenience, and short enough to avert catastrophe, but it changed a mood. People who had hours earlier been arguing about code and hypotheses found themselves standing near windows, looking into a sky lit by ordinary stars instead of screens. Conversations slowed. Someone on a rooftop in Lagos sang a quietly off-key melody into the night. A couple on a narrow street in Lisbon shared a lap and watched the Milky Way as if for the first time. The syllable, of course, did not stop because networks hiccuped. It continued, steady as ever. But now the context had shifted. Silence had taught the world to listen differently. Without the hum of constant notification, the repeated beats were no longer background interestingness. They edged toward the sublime. And then, impossibly, the syllables stopped. No gradual fade. There was a final cadence, a thought completed, and then only the hum of the cosmos and the far slower tick of human clocks. Instruments did not fail entirely. They recorded the cessation as faithfully as they recorded the arrival. Scientists pored over the logs, comparing timestamps, cross-checking calibrations, searching for artifact or instrumental mischief. They found none. The syllable had been real. Its absence was equally real. People made metaphors. Some called it a goodbye. Others called it a pause. Philosophy professors quoted ancient poets. Children asked their parents if the universe had simply pinged us to say hello, and then continued on its errands. A few older souls said something simpler. Perhaps not every visitor wants to be known. Perhaps the most generous message. is the one that leaves room for imagination. Weeks went by. There were tentative returns, faint echoes in certain bands, a flicker where a beat used to fall, but nothing like the patient fullness of the original. The world learned to live with that loss in the way it learns to live with the weather, by rearranging expectations and finding new small rituals to carry through the day. Cosmic detectives continued to search. Artists continued to sample. Matteo kept a pot of tea on his desk and a small spiral notebook where he wrote the hours as if they were prayers. The story, like all good lullabies, has many small seams where the truth slips through and becomes something else. There were technical lessons. Engineers redesigned redundancy in critical networks, and radio teams developed protocols to cross-validate during transient events. There were institutional lessons. International collaboration became less a lofty ideal and more a practical necessity. Money flowed to observatories and to community networks alike, and there were quieter lessons that no policy could fully inscribe. People learned how to trust silence for a moment, to notice the neighbors rustle across the hall, to feel the small, ordinary world again without the constant commentary of devices. But the deepest lesson came from something the syllable never said. In the absence of further transmissions, humans began to consider other minds differently. Some imagined civilizations older and stranger than us, whose technologies cradled different priorities. Some thought of personal loneliness stretching out into cosmic scale. Are we loud out of fear or out of habit? Others felt humbled. To realize there might be a cadence to the universe that does not cater to our timetable is to accept the planet as a small, beautiful instrument among many. In one of the small observatory cafeterias, long after the syllable had died away, Matteo met a young acoustician named Noor, who had traveled to see the arrays. They shared a pot of coffee and compared notes, their conversation wandering from Fourier transforms to old lullabies their grandmothers hummed. Noor said something that Matteo carried home. Perhaps all signals are invitations, to listen, to respond, to be present. Even if the other side never answers again, the act of listening has changed us. That change unfolded in little ways. Community labs formed in apartment buildings where citizens learned how to build simple radio receivers. Poetry slams took on cosmic themes. Schools assigned projects where children wrote hypothetical replies to a signal not to be sent, but to practice imagining another mind. Someone wrote a gentle protocol for responding to transients. Start with kindness, share facts openly, and never claim possession of a mystery. The world learned to be a little more modest about its reach, and a little more persistent with its curiosity. Decades later, when new instruments finally caught a faint whisper in a remote band, no one was surprised that the cosmos could be quiet for long intervals. They were only grateful. Matteo, older and quieter, sat beneath a small domestic telescope and watched as a distant flare pulsed in a way that echoed those old 4 and 3 beats. He smiled, not with certainty, but with the soft, steady joy of someone who had kept his chair warm for a guest who had once come to the door. This story offers no dramatic revelation, no neat puzzle piece that snaps into place with a satisfying click. It offers instead a slow education in attention. The syllable may have been a message, or a natural quirk, or a misfired mechanism of a forgotten star. Its origin matters less than the effect it had on the living beings who heard it. For a season, our species learned to quiet itself, to make room for a small, persistent rhythm that asked little, and, in asking so gently, taught a very large thing. That listening is a practice, and that the universe, in its tucking of light and withholding of answers, teaches us how to hold absence without becoming hollow. So, now, as you settle your head and let your breath lengthen into night, remember that somewhere out beyond the closest star, threads of light move like travelers along an old road. Sometimes they slip into the daylight and we do not notice. Sometimes they knock and then move on. And sometimes a single small sound arrives, enough to remind us that even in the quiet, there is conversation not always answered, not always understood, but received. Let the mystery be a blanket, warm and unresisting. Sleep with the knowledge that being a listener is a brave thing, and that the simple act of waiting can be an offering. Rest now, beneath a sky that keeps its secrets and shares them in the shape of rhythm. In the morning, the world will hum again, and the catalogues will be fuller for another entry. Tonight, dream of gentle beats and distant oceans of light, and know that somewhere, perhaps, another observer leans close and listens too. Hello, dreamers of the cosmos. Welcome back to Bedtime Universe, your celestial refuge among the stars, where we close our eyes, drift beyond the noise of Earth, and listen to the quiet stories written across the night sky. Tonight, we follow the path of a silent traveler, a wanderer from another star system, passing through our cosmic neighborhood for only a fleeting moment. It's a story of mystery, of discovery, and of how one small object reminded us just how vast and connected the universe truly is. So, find a comfortable place. Let the darkness around you turn gentle. Take a deep breath and let your mind float among the stars. This is The Silent Passenger, a story from beyond our solar system. They found it on a July morning when the southern sky still smelled faintly of winter and the Chilean observatory's domes were yawning awake. The alert came across a thin, efficient line of code. A new detection flagged by Atlas, marked as unusual, and then, as always, verified by a second, then a third scan. For the astronomers who lived by such alerts, the name that blinked into existence, 3I divided by Atlas, felt at first like an ordinary catalog entry, another dot on a sky the world had turned into a ledger. But very quickly, ordinary became impossible. From the first images, it refused to belong. It arrived on a track that did not bend to the sun's gravity the way comets from our own Oort cloud did. Its path was a sharp arc, a clean hyperbola that said, "With cold geometry, I am coming from elsewhere." The word interstellar traced itself through the lab like the shadow of a comet's tail, a rarity, a text that made scientists hold their breath in the same way sailors once did when sighting a whale on the horizon. Marta was the first person to say it out loud in the observation room. She had dark circles and a messy bun, and a way of naming things that made them sound less like data. "A visitor," she said. "A proper visitor." They called her team together, and their excitement was practical and stubborn, the kind that makes people in the middle of the night refuse bed. Telescopes across continents swiveled toward the coordinates. Radio dishes woke. Infrared cameras stretched their sensitivity. Even amateur stargazers, sipping coffee in suburban backyards, began to point their lenses and whisper. At first, the object was a bright, stubborn pin of light, small but steady. Then, as equipment grew more patient and the sun pulled it into a closer dance, the pin yielded a faint haze. A coma, a cloud of gas and dust, bloomed around the nucleus, the classical sign of cometary activity. Yet the usual rules of comets were written in old ink, and 3I divided by Atlas was in the awkward present tense. The composition readings came back like gossip, an excess of carbon dioxide, CO2, a coma dominated by gas, not often seen so prominently in comets from our neighborhood. Water vapor was present, but not like the main voice. It was an understudy. There was also a strange anti-tail, a fan of dust that seemed to point toward the sun rather than away, a trick of perspective and particle dynamics, but also an argument the object made against simple explanation. It suggested that the dust was not merely following the sun's invisible wind, but was shaped by larger, quirking forces. perhaps a rotation that flung material in particular patterns, perhaps a layered structure of volatile ices releasing in bursts. For every chart and spectrogram, there was an equal measure of wonder. The university radio room turned into a place where hypotheses were laid out like maps, each group sketching the same terrain and highlighting different contours. Some said, natural body, a comet from a cold, faraway system where ice chemistry favors CO2. Others, with wilder pens, suggested exotic surface processing or rare interactions with interstellar radiation fields. Nobody, in the room at least, said anything that approximated certainty. Outside, on the night the object made its closest approach visible to backyard telescopes, thousands stood with their necks cricked, eyes damp from the cold air and the weight of their own smallness. It was impossible to look at the sky with a human's heart and not feel moved. The comet's tail was a pale smear, a ghostly brushstroke on the canvas of stars. Lovers pointed hands, children made wishes. Some whispered, with a superstition as old as myths, that the sky had sent a messenger. Marta, who had spent much of her life learning to be exact with language, sat in a corner of the control room and wrote something down in the margin of her notebook. "We are the recipients." That notation felt less scientific and more humane. A recognition that we were, for a time, on the receiving end of an artifact from somewhere that was fundamentally not us. The scientific rush was one thing. Another thing was the public imagination. Newsrooms lit up. Social feeds churned with grainy captures and schematics drawn by hand. People who had never read a paper on orbital mechanics debated whether 3I divided by Atlas could be a probe, a relic, a natural object, or an artifact of imagination. The word alien spread like static, sometimes used carefully, more often as a spark to stoke attention. The scientists learned to behave like mediators. They leaned into the method that had brought them this far: observation, measurement, peer review. They developed narratives built from spectra rather than speculation. Press conferences began to look like geology lectures for the sky, calm, patient, and full of conditional verbs. They were careful, because speculation could be infectious, and because the responsibility weighing on their shoulders had nothing to do with fame, and everything to do with truth. As days passed, something else showed. The coma's brightness increased in pulses. The dust ejection was episodic, not continuous. Images suggested jets, localized plumes of material escaping from fissures, each puff a kilometer-scale exhalation. The nucleus, which remained unresolved by all but the most powerful instruments, seemed to fracture light and intent in ways the models did not predict. The antitail persisted, and with it the suggestion that we were not looking at a simple, homogeneous rock, but at something textured, weathered by a history we could only imagine. Marta and her colleagues began to feed the data into simulations. They spun models of the object's thermal profile, its rotation, its possible interior. Each simulation was a story. One showed a core layered with volatile rich strata, pockets of CO2, ice sealed beneath crusted regolith like photos in an album. Another imagined amorphous, porous conglomerates that, when heated by the sun, released gas in sudden bursts. These models were not answers. Rather, they were maps that traced plausible features on a world that refused to be directly seen. In the quiet hours before dawn, Marta would walk out to the concrete telescope platform and breathe in the thin air. The sky there felt close, neighborly in a way most city skies never could be. She would remind herself that everything they learned about 3I divided by Atlas came from photons that had traversed unimaginable distances. The object's arrival was a conversation in light, and each new measurement was an excerpt that allowed translation of a language only half remembered. News began to pick up the framing that the comet was doing something no comet had ever done. That phrase gleamed in headlines. It was true and not true, Every comet is in some sense unique, and yet 3I divided by Atlas carried a set of characteristics. Its composition, anti-tail, episodic jets, arranged in a way that made patterns from the unfamiliar. For the public, the novelty was intoxicating. For scientists, novelty was an invitation to test theories and to be humbled. Among those who watched the comet's ledger of behaviors closely was Dr. Ian Cho, a planetary spectroscopist with a gift for metaphor. He had a habit of writing letters to colleagues, as if they were to the cosmos. He drafted a note to Marta that began, "If this object is a letter, what does its paper tell us?" He argued that the high fraction of CO2 might reflect a protoplanetary disk chemistry, different from our own, a fingerprint of the environment that forged it. If so, then studying 3I divided by Atlas was like reading a geological survey from another system. Each molecule was an echo of conditions under alien stars. While they argued and modeled, some engineers quietly proposed more ambitious plans. The idea was not to chase the comet. Its velocity and hyperbolic escape would make interception wildly expensive and technologically challenging, but to send small, fast flybys or to point more sensitive instruments at it during its brief brightening passage. There were programs that could repurpose satellites and telescopes, tweak observation schedules, and chase shadows on the sky with an urgency unfamiliar to bureaucrats. The thought of hardware paying attention as humanity watched felt appropriate, as if both machines and people should witness the same event. Then there were the philosophical consequences, the late-night conversations about what it meant to have visitors at all. A philosopher joined a symposium and asked, gently, if our eagerness to assign agency to 3I divided by Atlas revealed more about our anxieties than about the object itself. When we ask whether a comet is an instrument or an artifact, are we looking for proof of companionship, or are we merely searching for reassurance that we are not alone? The question hung in the hall like a cometary dust grain, tiny but luminous when the light hit just so. The comet's behavior became a public liturgy. People in small towns planned viewing parties. School children drew representations of its tail. Poets tried to catch its motion in verse. On streaming platforms, amateur astronomers with shaky mounts uploaded time-lapse compilations that turned the passing into a kind of choreography. A brightening, a bloom, an anti-tail that resolved into grainy ribbons. Each video was an attempt to capture the ephemeral. As observational months failed to stretch into the years required for close study, the urgency grew. Scientists published rapid open-access preprints, each one a scaffold of data and polite conjecture. The preprints themselves became collective storytelling graphs, spectra, and cautious prose, forming sentences that could be argued and tested. The scene was a laboratory of transparency. When the world's telescopes were aimed at a single guest, the academic community realized that the fastest path to understanding lay in sharing. The comet, for its part, continued to be inscrutable. On a day when the comet was closest to the sun perihelion, the nights were short and the instruments were busy. The heat of the inner system flicked volatile ices awake, and the jets were more pronounced. The anti-tail sharpened to a fine, almost deliberate streak. Spectroscopy showed fluctuations in the relative abundances of certain species. At times, the spectrum hinted at complex organics molecules, whose signatures are the same building blocks of life's chemistry. But those signals were faint and ambiguous, swallowed sometimes by noise and instrumental quirks. The spectroscopists were careful not to overclaim. They annotated frequency bands with long lists of uncertainties. Still, the possibility that primitive, carbon-based molecules were part of the mix fed both science and imagination. It reminded everyone of how small the difference between alien and familiar can be at the molecular level. The chemistry that builds prebiotic molecules is not proprietary. It is universal, a consequence of carbon's affinity for forming chains and rings when given energy and time. In this, 3i divided by Atlas was both alien and a cousin. The more they learned, the more the object's past opened up as a set of hypotheses. Perhaps it had formed in the cold outskirts of a young star's disk, a family of planetesimals shuffled into interstellar space by gravitational tugs and chaotic interactions. Perhaps it had once orbited a dim red star and been flung outward by a passing giant or a violent birth of a planet. These were stories, and stories need not be precise to be powerful. As the comet retreated, its velocity increased, and its profile dimmed into a blur once more. People marked the moment with a quiet grief. There is a human tendency to mourn what is transient, even when the transient is a tumble of rock and ice. It had arrived and taught. Now it would leave and be reduced to new points in new datasets at other observatories. For some, it was a farewell. For others, it was the end of a conversation that had never truly been two-sided. In the months after the comet's passage, debates persisted. Was 3i divided by Atlas truly exceptional, or did our improved observational network mean we were now more likely to catch such interstellar wanderers? The answer, like most answers, held shades. The detection capabilities of modern telescopes are unprecedented, and so the number of known interstellar visitors rose by the virtue of tools. Yet the composition and behavior of this object were distinct enough to prompt papers and panels that argued for targeted future surveys, improvements in early detection cadence, and increased coordination among observatories across the globe. Marta, when interviews came, tried to keep her public voice steady. She knew the danger of myth-making, how casually we can turn a scientific object into an omen, a totem, or a stealthy visitor with intent. It came, she said in a televised roundtable, and it brought its own chemistry, its own shape. We measured, we observed, we learned. The universe is full of surprises. Part of science is learning to listen and then trying to understand what you heard. Her personal notes, however, were different. She kept a private journal, a ritual that had little to do with professional pride and more with the need to anchor oneself when the sky rearranged its furniture. In those pages she wrote not as a scientist but as a witness. She described nights when the northern sky had been clear, when the comet had been a whisper and the world had felt like an audience to a cosmic performance. She wrote of the enormity of being the species that could not only watch, but also, with instruments and reason, begin to read these visitors' pages. The comet's legacy took root in smaller, subtler ways. Curricula adapted. University courses added modules about interstellar objects. Amateur astronomy societies saw a surge in membership. Funding agencies, sensing public interest, approved grants for better detection algorithms and for dust analyzers that might ride future craft. The passage of 3i divided by Atlas had, in its brief performance, shifted priorities. It had showed where attention could be profitable in both knowledge and wonder. There were still late-night forums where people allowed themselves a different kind of speculation. An old professor posted a thread that posited a thought experiment. If an interstellar object were intentionally engineered, what would its designers reveal first? The ensuing discussion was civil, imaginative, and always respectful of the boundary between speculation and evidence. The thread ended, as such things often do, with a collective shrug and a renewed appreciation for ambiguity. In the long view, the sky swallowed the object as it hurtled away on its eternal trajectory. New telescopes in space and on the ground were commissioned, not only to find more such travelers, but to be ready with richer instruments when the next one came. The scientific community had learned lessons about rapid collaboration, open data sharing, and the spiritual economy of discovery. That it is worth investing in the capacity to notice and to respond. Years later, in a panel at an international conference, Marta sat among colleagues as young scientists presented papers on molecules found in 3i divided by Atlas's coma on dust textures that suggested a history of collisional gardening, on isotopic ratios that hinted at a stellar nursery cooler than our own sun's birthplace. Each presentation was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry more detailed than the sketch the first nights had allowed. The comet, that had once been a quick brightening in the southern sky, had now become a chapter in a longer story about exchange, about the way our system receives and sometimes returns material from its galactic neighborhood. At the conference, they celebrated the collaborative ethos the discovery had galvanized. Journals published special issues. Schools taught modules. The public retained a memory of that strange anti-tale, and the phrase, 3I divided by Atlas, entered amateur lexicons, the way a song enters a neighborhood. It was hummed in coffee shops, and mentioned with easy nostalgia on social platforms. But even with all the analyses and models, something remained irreducible. The sense that an object had come from elsewhere and had, for a brief moment, brushed our attention. Science had recorded its chemistry, charted its motion, and argued about its nature. Yet the most human reactions were not in the graphs. They were in the small ways people had looked up together and felt, for a time, participants in a cosmos that continues to move and to send. Marta kept a small printed photograph taped into her notebook, a grainy but honest image of the comet's faint anti-tail. Beneath it, she had written a single line. We were shown a page. She meant the sentence, both literally and metaphorically. 3I divided by Atlas had been a page torn from another world's archive, drifting through space until, by a chain of chance and calculation, it was visible to us. Reading that page required instruments and expertise, yes, but it also required a kind of cultural humility, an admission that the universe does not exist solely as backdrop to human affairs, but as an active participant in a broader ecology of exchange. As years passed and more interstellar visitors were detected, some smaller, some stranger, some blunter in their composition, humanity learned to listen more skillfully. We built telescopes that could pass more complex spectra, algorithms that could distinguish subtle peculiarities, networks that coordinated observation across time zones and continents. Each object taught us not only about chemistry and dynamics, but also about a method of attention. Be ready, be modest, and above all, share. Sometimes, when Marta walked beneath a clean, unpolluted sky and noticed a faint streak that could have been anything, she smiled at the memory of that first July morning. She remembered the hush that had spread across the world's observatories as 3I divided by Atlas was named and catalogued. She remembered the mixture of nerves and delight, the way humanity's curiosity had felt like a ship turning toward a distant flare. If there was an ending to this part of the story, it was that we had been changed more than the comet. 3I divided by Atlas, as it left, had taken with it a small portion of our attention. It had scattered our questions into the dark. In return, it left a little more than tracks and spectral lines. It left a new habit, the habit of looking up and considering, with patience and rigor, the objects that pass through the spaces between the stars. That habit itself was a kind of promise. It promised more encounters, more pages from other archives that might one day tell us things we had not thought to ask. It promised that the sky would continue to be a place not only of mystery, but also of method, an arena where wonder and discipline could meet, and through that meeting, enlarge what we know of the universe and of ourselves. Late one evening, years after the comet's passage, Marta found an old recording of the first broadcast of 3I divided by Atlas's detection. She listened to the clipped voices that had been younger then, the taut cadence of excitement and an emotion she could not name rose in her chest. Gratitude, perhaps, or the small, sharp pleasure of having been present when the universe opened, briefly, to show us something new. She turned the recording off, looked up through the window at the band of the Milky Way, and whispered, as one might to a neighbor, "Come again." And so, the silent traveler drifts away, back into the deep ocean of interstellar space, leaving behind only a shimmer of memory and a quiet reminder that we, too, are travelers here. Every now and then, the universe sends us a visitor, not to answer our questions, but to remind us how beautiful it is to keep asking them. Perhaps 3 divided by Atlas was never meant to speak, only to pass by and to show us a single, glimmering page from another world's story. As you rest tonight, imagine yourself floating beside that comet, weightless, calm, and endlessly curious, watching the stars slide by in infinite silence. Because out there, beyond every horizon, the universe is still writing, and sometimes, if we're quiet enough, we can hear it whisper. Thank you for joining this journey tonight, here, on Bedtime Universe, where dreams are written among the stars. Sleep well, traveler. And now, as the night grows deeper and the world grows quieter, let us drift into our next journey. A story carried on the darkness above us, a story written in light. Tonight, we will follow what poets once called a river across the heavens, a gentle current of stars flowing silently through the sky. This story is called The Quiet River of Stars. Close your eyes and picture a place without the noise of lamps or screens, a place where the air settles cool on your skin and the horizon is a clean black bowl. In that bowl, the river appears soft, milky, faint at first, as if someone brushed white chalk from one horizon to the other. This is the band of our own galaxy seen from within, a sideways view of the spiral disk that holds us. People have named it for as long as we have looked up. A road of light, a milk spill of the gods, a path for souls, a sky river. Astronomers give it a simpler name, the Milky Way. But names are just doors. The wonder is what you feel when you step through. If your eyes are dark adapted, 20 minutes without bright light, no phone, no car, headlights, the band lifts itself out of the background. You begin to notice texture. The river is not smooth. It is threaded with dark inlets and quiet eddies where the light thins. Those are not holes at all, but lanes of interstellar dust, thin as smoke and wide as light years, drifting between the stars and absorbing their glow. Along the band are brighter knots and hazy patches where new stars are kindling inside clouds of hydrogen. Somewhere near the middle, low on a summer night in the south, the river swells into a soft bulge. That is the direction of the galactic center, toward the constellations Sagittarius and Scorpius, where the star clouds are dense and the dust lanes cut like long black rivers within the river. We stand on a small world circling a very ordinary star. Our sun is a yellow-white dwarf among hundreds of billions, set out on a suburban lane called the Orion Arm. Some call it the Orion Cygnus Arm, or simply the local arm, a minor spiral lane between 2 larger ones. Perseus on one side and Scutum Centaurus on the other. From this neighborhood, we look edge-on through the disk, and the light piles up, star behind star behind star, until the sky looks like spilled milk to the human eye. If you could jump out of the galaxy and look from above, you would see the disk as a broad spiral about 100,000 light-years across, with the sun not at the center but off to one side, roughly 26 to 28,000 light-years from the core. Numbers can feel large. Let them slow your breathing. A single light-year is the distance light travels in a year. The starlight taking shape as that pale band tonight began its journey long before your grandparents were born, and in some parts of the band, long before humans ever spoke. There is a black heart at the center, but not empty dense. A supermassive black hole we call Sagittarius A*, about 4 million times the mass of our sun, sits in the core like a city's weight under all the light. Around it, the bulge is crowded with old stars. Their orbits are tight, their dances swift. Astronomers have watched some of those stars loop the black hole in short centuries and decades, their paths bending under a gravity that is both invisible and absolute. You cannot see any of that from a dark field, of course. What you see is the echo. The middle of the river grows brighter and wider, and the dust lanes cut across it like slow thunderheads. Downstream and upstream from that swelling, the band thins and threads through the constellations like a silk ribbon, through the tail of Scorpius, through the teapot shape of Sagittarius, up past the eagle Aquila, across the bright cross of Cygnus and its long tail to Deneb, curving toward Cassiopeia's crooked W in autumn, and back down through the horns of Taurus in winter. Listen to the quiet of that river. Beneath its light is a weather of gas and dust, mapped not by clouds and rain, but by faint glows at specific colors. Hydrogen, breathing in a deep red, we call H-alpha. Oxygen in a soft teal, dust grains scattering blue like smoke. The glow is not a roar, but a whisper. New stars form in cocooned nurseries. The Orion Nebula, a flowering knot in the sword of Orion. The Carina Nebula, bright and knotted in the southern sky. The Lagoon and Trifid in Sagittarius. Side by side, one, a wide pool of glowing hydrogen, the other, a pale blossom banded by dust. In those places, gravity gathers gas until the pressure and temperature rise high enough for hydrogen to fuse into helium and light, and a star is lit. For millions of years, radiation and stellar winds carve caves and pillars out of the clouds, and when the most massive stars end, they end with a generosity that shakes their neighborhoods. A supernova enriches the surrounding gas with heavier elements, the stuff of planets and rock and you. The river recycles. The river teaches the same old lesson softly. Endings and beginnings are parts of one flow. Where you stand matters. At mid-latitudes, the Milky Way arches like a great bridge from south to north in summer. In the tropics, the core climbs high, and the river thickens overhead, finer texture, more star cloud, more dark lane. In winter, the band tilts, and though the core is hidden on your side of the planet, the river still threads through Orion and Gemini, lace-fine and quieter. From the far south, different reaches are revealed. The Southern Cross standing near the riverbank like a marker. We forget, under city domes and office ceilings, that the sky changes with season and latitude. The river reminds us if we let it. The facts can be gentle if we speak them softly. The disk that makes this band is not flat as a plate. It is warped, as if a slow hand had lifted its edges unevenly. The sun and its planets ride a wavy midplane, dipping above, then below the disk, over tens of millions of years. Our star orbits the center at roughly 200 kilometers per second, and a full lap around the galaxy, the so-called galactic year, takes something like 200 to 250 million Earth years. Think of that. One slow turn of the river's wheel, and the calendar on your wall is emptied 1,000 times. In that span, continents drift, mountains lift and wear away, new languages are born and forgotten, and the sky rivers for every creature who looks up is both the same and not quite the same, because our vantage point is always moving, always slightly changed. Far beyond the disk are the globular clusters, old and round, each a ball of ancient stars, hundreds of thousands gathered into spheres that drift in the galaxy's halo like lanterns at a festival. They are not on the river itself. They are like lights hung in high trees along the banks, thick with red giants and blue stragglers. Their chemistry, old and spare. Look for M13 in Hercules, a hazy cotton knot with a steady heartbeat of stars. Look for 47 Tucanae in the south, a larger, brighter hive of sun candles, densely packed. Those clusters are fossils of early times. The river runs newer in the disk, where gas still pools and stirs. There is a quiet address you can memorize if it helps you sleep. You live in the local bubble, a kind of low-density cavity in the interstellar medium, likely carved by ancient supernovae long ago. That bubble overlaps with your neighbor's bubbles like soap suds, and on its walls, new stars have been born and will be born. You live in the Orion Arm, part of a barred spiral galaxy roughly a third of the way out from the center. Your sun is one of hundreds of billions. Many of those stars have planets. We know this now not as a guess, but as a repeated measurement, a song of small dips in starlight, of tiny wobbles and split spectral lines that mean a world is tugging. Somewhere, on some night under a different sky, someone could point up and trace their own river, and know that a small world is looking back, equally curious and equally tired in the good way of a long day's end. Turn your mind along the river's route, and let it walk by landmarks you may know in name even if you've never seen them raw. There is the Great Rift, a long chain of dust lanes running through Cygnus, dimming the river and dividing it into two pale streams. There is the North America Nebula, a red map of a continent in hydrogen glow. There is the Aquila Rift, a darker branch. The star clouds of Scutum, the small, bright M24, sometimes called the small Sagittarius star cloud, like a window where the dust thins, and you can see deeper than usual. There is the Pipe Nebula in Ophiuchus, a simple L-shaped darkness that stands out simply because it has the courage to be black against all that light. Each one is a piece of texture. Each one is a reminder that the river's softness is made of millions of hard-edged facts. If you lifted above the river, if you climbed out of the disk and looked back, the band would fold itself into a grand design. A central bar, spiral arms unwinding, star formation, tracing those arms like frost blooming along glass. Tidal interactions with small satellite galaxies tug on the edges. The Magellanic Clouds leave a stream of gas, like a wake on the galaxy's sea. Dark matter unseen, but weighing far more than all the stars, holds the whole structure together, an invisible frame carrying most of the mass. You do not need the details to rest. It is enough to know that the quiet you feel beneath the river is supported by something strong and steady. And there is a future even for rivers. Long from now, so far that it occupies the part of the mind where fairy tales live. The Andromeda Galaxy and the Milky Way will draw together. They already are. Andromeda is coming toward us slowly in human terms, and quickly in cosmic ones. In several billion years, the two spirals will begin to interpenetrate and merge. It will not be a crash of suns. The spaces between stars are so large that very few will meet head-on. Instead, orbits will reshape, gas will rattle and compress, bursts of star formation will ignite, and the final result will be a new, larger galaxy with a new shape, a new river. No one you know will be there to see it. But somehow, the knowledge feels soothing. Even grand structures have arcs to their stories, and change at that scale is a tide you can let lift you into sleep. Perhaps you are listening from a city, and the river is hidden behind a dome of light. That is all right. Part of the story of this river is that it is patient. It has waited for eyes to look up in deserts and on ships, and in mountain meadows, and on quiet balconies, when the power went out and the night returned to its ancient depth. If you ever find yourself somewhere dark on a beach after the moon sets, on a hillside at 2 in the morning, on a ferry deck where the wind keeps you awake, give your pupils time. Turn off the lamp. Let the cones in your eyes rest. Let the rods take over. Let the glow sharpen. At first you will see grey. Then the grey will thicken into a woven cloth. Then a dark seam will run through it, and a bright knot will appear, and another, and the river will be there, in a way no photograph can quite teach. Breathe in, and let it lay a hand on your shoulder. If you want a simple ritual to bring you closer to the river from anywhere, try this. Imagine your mind is a slow raft. Set it upon the band of light and let it drift. As you float, count gentle truths instead of sheep. 1. The light of Deneb has been traveling for more than 1,000 years to reach you. It left the star when empires were drawing new borders on parchment and never stopped. 2. The sun is circling the galaxy. Tonight you moved many thousands of kilometers around the center without feeling a thing. 3. The atoms in your blood were made in stars. The iron in your hemoglobin was built in the core of a dying sun before the Earth existed. 4. Somewhere deep in the band are clusters where stars are born every year from dust and gas. their infant light pushing away the very clouds that sheltered them. 5. The river you see is the edge-on sum of 100 billion worlds, all real, all turning, all warming their own nights. By the time you reach 6 or 7, you will feel the river pulling on you in the way a lullaby does, not with force, but with belonging. It is not just sight that brings you into the river's quiet. There is the sense of scale, spacious in a way that gives room to whatever you carried to bedtime. A worry that filled your whole day can sit on the riverbank for a while, not gone but smaller against the spread of things. There is the rhythm of cycles, short and long, your breath, the beating of your heart, the rotation of the earth, bringing night and day, the sweep of the moon around us, tracing tides. The path of the earth around the sun, bringing seasons, the sun's path around the galaxy, bringing epochs, the galaxy's future dance with its neighbors, bringing transformations. Each cycle holds what came before. As you listen, you are held too. For those who like details tucked under the pillow, there are a few more to rest on. The disk of the galaxy is not just stars. It contains spiral waves, patterns where gas and dust compress and release as they orbit, like cars bunching and separating on a ring road. Where the wave compresses, star formation lights up, and the arm looks brighter. Between arms, the light softens, but does not end. The dust lanes are not dirty. They are the raw material for future light, and they redden starlight, passing through them the way a sunset reddens the Sunday. On clear, moonless nights, observers in very dark places can see the zodiacal light, a faint triangle along the ecliptic, sunlight scattered by dust within our own solar system, the Gegenschein, an even fainter brightening opposite the Sunday. These small additions are like fireflies near the bank, joining the river but separate from it. If rhythm helps you rest, we can set the story to 1. The river rises in the south, flows up through the Eagle, crosses the Swan's Back, passes the Queen's Chair, and falls again toward the Hunter's Belt by winter, then settles, then returns. With every return, you are a little older, and so is the light you see, but the pattern holds. This is the part of astronomy that feels like a kind hand. The sky is not a puzzle to be solved and set aside. It is a companion you can visit. The more you learn of its facts, the more it rewards you with feeling. Knowing the name of a nebula does not steal its mystery. It adds a note to a chord you already love, and still, beneath all the texture and all the numbers, there is the simple act of lying back and letting the white band pour across you. Somewhere along that band, on a small world with a name we have not learned, another listener may be doing the same, letting their mind drift along their river, counting their truths, thinking their own future, and carrying their own day into the kind night. When you share the river, you share something large without needing to own it. The light is given freely. The time was paid long ago by the stars themselves. If you find your thoughts wandering to distances and durations, let them. Let the mind take a slow walk. Light crossing the space between stars, collapsing gas, warming into stars, planets taking shape from rings of dust, like snowflakes growing on a window pane, oceans forming, air thickening, creatures lifting their eyes. None of this is rushed. The river has room for slow stories. Your story is one of them. Now the night grows deeper still, and the world grows quieter still, and the river goes on doing what it has done since before there were people. It gathers the light of uncountable suns into a band we can understand at a glance. Not everything has to be solved. Some things are here to be trusted. The Milky Way is one of them. You can rest beneath it without finish lines or arguments. It will still be flowing when you wake. So breathe in and breathe out, and let the quiet river of stars carry you. If your eyes are closed, picture that soft band and the dark lanes braided through it. Picture the bulge low on the horizon, like a slow sunrise of far-off suns. Picture the way it arches up and over, east to west, season to season, age to age. If your eyes are open and lucky enough to be in the dark, Let the band have you whole for a minute. Let it make every small noise in your life seem smaller, and every kind thought seem larger. In the end, that is what the river is for. It is a reminder that we live inside something vast and patient and ongoing, and that our days, bright, messy, dear, are carried along by a current we can trust. When you are ready, you may set your raft against the bank and step into sleep. The river will be here when you drift back in the morning. It always is. It always has been. Good night. May the hush of the galaxy be the hush of your room. And may the quiet river of stars guide you gently, steadily, all the way into rest. Close your eyes and breathe slowly. Tonight we tell a story that lives between circuits and starlight, a gentle tale that unfolds in 1 week when the world hesitated, when machines and stars both turned away. It begins with an ordinary night and then asks you to imagine the extraordinary. On a morning in October, the internet stilled. Phones that always sang with messages fell silent. Apps that responded like friends stopped answering. A data center in Virginia, the slow pulsing heart of so much human chatter, went dark as if someone had covered the planet's mouth. For hours, billions of small, constant connections that stitch our days together were not there. People sat with empty screens and found, to their surprise, an unfamiliar quiet at the center of their lives. While technicians in windowless rooms traced failures and rebooted the machines we treat as invisible infrastructure, astronomers in glass observatories watched something else disappear. An interstellar visitor named 3I divided by Atlas, slipping behind the Sunday. This was no ordinary comet. It arrived from another star, carrying the slow history of distant light. Scientists had tracked it with care, measuring its angle, its speed, the pale chemistry of its light. They called it a messenger from elsewhere, a fragment carrying stories older than our own sky. And then, as the world wrestled with a collapsing network, the visitor met the sun's glare and was lost to our instruments. For a time that felt like a held breath, Earthbound watchers had neither network nor sky. 2 blind spots opened in the same week, one in code, one in light. People whispered coincidence. Engineers spoke of cascading failures and overloaded systems. Astronomers explained that solar conjunction steals sight and that physics keeps its distance. But the coincidence felt like a mirror placed between the human and the cosmic. It asked whether we had created fragile things, and whether, for a few nights, both the sky and our inventions could step back and show us what we had taken for granted. So lean back into your pillow and let the details settle like soft dust. In the data centers, machines that route names to numbers, the DNS servers, began to fail. Monitoring tools that supervise other tools went blind. Databases became unreachable like rooms with locked doors. The architecture that makes countless invisible decisions every second suddenly found itself without a map. Services based on these hidden protocols faltered. Voices paused, ledgers stopped updating, animations froze in mid-motion. Those working inside the centers felt a peculiar helplessness. Their instruments could not instrument themselves. They became listeners to a silence they could not measure. On the other side of the world, telescopes trained on a streak of light captured the comet's fine smoke and faint minerals, its peculiar chemistry that did not quite match familiar icy travelers. It showed traces of metals and gases in patterns that teased questions about its origin. How a fragment shaped in another home star's cradle might carry unexpected alloys and volatiles. A comet like that promises revelations. It is a messenger body, a geological postcard. And then the postcard passes behind the sun's brightness, and those pages become unreadable. In that darkness, the comet might have warmed, fractured, shed material. It might have adopted a new shape, a new voice, and yet for days we could not know. Across forums and cafes and late-night threads, people constructed small mythologies to lighten their unease. Some imagined a hacker hiding behind the cosmic event, timing chaos to the moment when our focus would tilt sunward. Others pictured a strategic actor watching calendars and counting on our disbelief. The human mind is a storyteller by habit. It seeks pattern in the overlap, and still, most experts return to grounded explanations. Centralized infrastructure, human error, the stubborn gravity of networks dependent on single geographies. But this story, held gently now between your hands, is less about proving conspiracy than about noticing fragility. Months before, cables on the ocean floor had shown us how physical our virtual world actually is. Submarine fibers carry the hum of nations and can snap under anchors or be disturbed by storms and earthquakes. Earlier that year, a solar outburst had flirted with catastrophe. A coronal ejection roared from the sun and missed Earth by a narrow tilt, a near miss that reminded the world of how small margins hold big systems together. Another incident had silenced sophisticated artificial minds for hours, exposing how dependent businesses and caregivers had become on synthetic voices. All these events wove a pattern, a fragile lattice where a single break could ripple into a global pause. When 3i, divided by Atlas, disappeared behind the sun, it took with it a small, stubborn hope of direct knowledge. Scientists yearn for continuous observation. Gaps that the sun enforces are gaps that might hide transformation. Perhaps the comet lost mass and shed dust into a tail the size of cities. Perhaps it flared and altered its path. Perhaps it simply passed, indifferent. When it re-emerged, telescopes would answer some questions, but not the ones for that dark interval. The world that woke from the outage carried a new awareness. There was a strange gratitude for the hum of devices that had before been invisible burdens, and a simultaneous unease at how dependent life had grown on unseen scaffolding. In bedrooms where phones were silent, people noticed small sounds, distant traffic, the creak of a refrigerator, a neighbor's laughter. Tiny things, easily drowned by constant notification chimes, found room to be noticed. At the same time, the scientists who watched the sky felt the hollowness of an observation gap. The universe keeps no diary for us. If we miss a moment because sunlight blinds our instruments, that fragment is gone to human record. Over weeks, teams pieced together forensic timelines and observational logs. Networks were restarted and patched, cables rerouted, and checks implemented. The comet's afterglow returned to charts and spectra, and astronomers compared notes about subtle differences in brightness and composition. The public kept asking a simple question: could anything from the void touch our wired world? Physicists smiled the careful smile of deferment and explained distances, fields, and energies. The sun's light could not tug at a server rack in Virginia, and a comet many millions of miles away could not flip a router. And yet, in the hush that followed, a more human answer took hold. Nothing needed to touch us for the event to matter. The overlap had been enough to make us look inward. Maybe that is the real lesson of the week. The cosmos and our constructions share a border where human perception happens. When both sides darken, we are left to learn how dependent we are on light and on lines of code. The comet's return, weeks later, offered a quiet epilogue. 3i divided by Atlas emerged as a softer presence, its tail suggesting it had been altered by heat, its spectral lines carrying evidence of materials shaped by foreign chemistry. Astronomers celebrated small triumphs, refined orbits, a deeper sense of origin, but the memory of silence persisted. Engineers rewired processes, built more resilient paths, and imagined systems that could fail gracefully. Communities discussed contingency, backups for more than data, for communication, and for the human routines that depend on it. And still, when night fell afterward, a subtle tenderness remained in the air. People imagined the sky as a room full of visitors, some passing quickly, others lingering. They imagined their devices as fragile lights in a larger dark. Tonight, as you settle, imagine those two blind spots, not as threats, but as teachers. Feel the smallness and the wonder that come with understanding how precarious connection can be. Let the fact that the world and the sky pause together be a soothing reminder. Even grand systems take breaths. Perhaps there is comfort in knowing that silence can reset us, that a week without the relentless hum can widen space for noticing. Perhaps there is a lesson about humility, that our reach into the universe is still young, that we are learning to keep watch with limited eyes. In the hush that follows every blackout and every skyward blackout, a question remains soft and patient. What will we do with the knowledge that our web is delicate? Will we build redundancies that mirror the complexity of life, or will we continue to thread everything through a few thin tunnels? Those choices will shape future nights. For now, breathe slowly and think of a pale fragment leaning into the sun, of server rooms where lights came back on, of people who found unexpected quiet in the spaces where their phones used to be loud. Sleep with the image of a world that paused and then resumed, a little wiser for the interruption. Know that the stars continue their passage, and that our networks will hum again, but with a gentler understanding of their place in the dark. Let this story be a soft lullaby, a reminder that even in silence there is company, that blind spots are invitations to look inward, and that the cosmos, in its cold grandeur, can fold space and time into lessons for our fragile, splendid lives. In the days that followed, small rituals returned like tides. People learned once again to wait for answers rather than demand immediate confirmation. They rediscovered patience, calling a friend and listening until the line breathed, reading a page until the margins blurred with sleep, looking up at the night and letting the stars happen instead of photographing them. Communities gathered to talk about contingency with a newfound seriousness that felt reverent rather than fearful. Local libraries extended hours, neighborhood centers set up notice boards. Elders taught how to keep paper records and how to share news by voice, by human chain, when glass fails. Engineers, exhausted and precise, filled whiteboards with diagrams that tried to imagine a network without a single beating heart. They argued about geography and policy, about whether redundancy should mean multiple continents or 1,000 smaller nodes. A teenage coder in Jakarta sketched out a vision for a mesh network that could bypass centralized regions. An old technician in Virginia, hands flavored with oil and light, remembered days when systems were simple and manual, and he lobbied for more human-readable logs. Astronomers, too, rewired their expectations. Observatories coordinated more international observation windows. Radio arrays practiced listening in tandem with optical telescopes. Amateurs with backyard scopes were encouraged to share raw footage to catch moments professional arrays might miss. Scientists composed new plans for catching the next interstellar whisper. Instrument arrays that could observe the sunlit side indirectly. Relay stations placed at Lagrange points. A ballet of satellites that promised fewer blind intervals. In coffee shops and on late-night radio, people spoke of wonder. The comet became a small myth, a reminder of distance and continuity, of the fact that we are not alone in moving through a universe that does not revolve around our convenience. Poets wrote about the week the world went silent, comparing the outage to an old wind that clears dust from a room. Musicians composed long, slow pieces that imitated the dead pause and the gentle reintroduction of sound. Mothers told children a bedtime version of the event, a soft parable about a tiny traveler who got too close to the sun and needed to hide behind its bright skirts for a while. In these retellings, the comet was kinder, full of mystery and mercy. Through it all, A subtle policy conversation emerged about how much society ought to let critical infrastructure consolidate. It was uncomfortable. It touched on profit and efficiency, and the invisible trade-offs of convenience. Yet it was also practical. Planners discussed staggered deployment, more fiber routes, and incentives for distributed cloud alternatives. Years later, the week remained a touchstone. When systems failed in minor ways, people compared the pause to that October silence and asked whether new designs honored the lesson. Schools taught modules on the physicality of the internet, mixing geology and computer science, so that future engineers would remember cables on the sea as well as code in the cloud. In quiet moments, astronauts on the International Space Station looked toward the horizon and thought about tiny visitors that cross between stars. They felt a kinship with the transient, with the idea that even structures as carefully maintained as orbital platforms can meet moments that are beyond prediction. And somewhere, tucked into the memory of this episode, was humility, a realization that mastery is always partial. For all our dashboards and sensors and blooming arrays of data, there remains an irreducible sliver of the unknown. We can reduce it, narrow it, but perhaps never erase it. Remember the dates, October 20th and October 21st, 2025. Remember the hush in time. It is useful to keep precise anchors because memory is a landscape made of small pebbles and named stones. On those nights, people learned that the pulse of daily life is a composite beat made of tiny technical heartbeats. A cashier's terminal that could not reach the ledger, a doctor delayed in retrieving a record, a message that arrived hours late. These were small disturbances, but they added up into a world briefly rearranged. Consider the smell of a server room after power cycles and human hands work through the night. A metallic ozone tang, the warmth of machines exhaling, the faint scent of coffee and focused exhaustion. Those small sensory details tether the abstract idea of an outage to human bodies working in fluorescent-lit rooms. Consider the cold brightness of a telescope dome at dawn, instruments slanting toward a faint smear of light, astronomers wrapped in scarves against the chill. They check collimators, tighten fittings, and whisper to each other as if the comet were a sleeping child to be checked without waking. This story is also about small kindnesses. A neighbor lending a flashlight, a barista offering a phone to make a call, an older person explaining how to keep records without relying on a cloud. Those actions are the quiet scaffolding that supports resilience. From policy rooms to kitchen tables, conversations began about designing systems for the long view. How do we plan for the eventuality of silence? How do we multiply sources of light so that when one goes out, others remain to guide us? Engineers proposed decentralized caches that could operate locally for hours or days. City planners mentioned analog backups for critical services. Educators suggested simple curricula that taught children to send messages by paper and to navigate without constant confirmation of location. A gentle, almost tender cultural shift occurred, a move away from the tyrant of immediate response toward an acceptance that some things can wait and that waiting can be a form of respect. And yet, despite the lessons, life resumed its usual acceleration. Notifications returned, algorithms re-engaged, and the world went back to its old tempo. But there is a residue to such moments, a quiet skepticism, a new whisper of caution in system design meetings, a poem scrawled in margins that remembers the week networks slept. Think of nights like this as small clearing storms, where the sky opens a little and we see the scaffolding. The comet, cold and indifferent, moved along its ancient trajectory. The outage, human and rectifiable, demanded technical humility. Both events converged into a single gentle demand that we pay attention to the seams. By the time the comet returned to full view, cameras and spectrographs painted a picture richer than before. The traveler had been warned. Its surface chemistry bore subtle changes. The data did not conclude a conspiracy, nor did it produce a grand revelation. Instead, it handed us quiet facts that are the bricks of knowledge: shifted brightness, altered tail morphology, and a few spectral hints of metals uncommon in typical solar comets. In lecture halls and late-night chats, people debated whether we had missed a message the universe had tried to send. The more patient answer was that the universe rarely sends messages to order. It offers phenomena, and we interpret them with the tools at hand. Sometimes our tools are asleep, and the phenomena continue anyway. So tonight, let this story be less about fear and more about caretaking. Imagine engineers as gardeners tending networks, astronomers as night watchpersons tending a fragile sky, and yourself as a gentle observer, learning to relish silence as much as sound. Let the comet be a lullaby of distance and the outage a chorus of domestic proximity. They are two notes in the music of our age, one reminding us of how far we can look, the other of how close we are to the systems we rely on. Now, breathe slowly. Allow images of slow-moving light and warm server rooms to settle. Hear the small sounds, the distant washing of a neighbor's roof, an engine humming, your own breath moving in the dark. These are the textures of continuity. When you awaken, there will be new data, new measures, and perhaps new policies. But for this night, accept the pause. Let the silence that once frightened become a space where you practice listening. Feel the ease of leaving a device unlit and the quiet luxury of not knowing for a little while. In the long story of humanity, these are but small pages. Yet sometimes small pages turn into chapters. The week the world went silent will be remembered for practical changes, yes, but also for how it taught a global public the ancient craft of waiting. Sleep now, under the patient sky. Imagine the comet following its long road through the dark, a tiny ship crossing the ocean of stars, and imagine our lights below, fragile but stubborn, pulsing back into life with care. Rest, knowing that silence can teach, and that the next morning will come with both new questions and renewed resolve. In this hush, remember the tender fact that we are still learning to be citizens of a large and indifferent cosmos. Be kind to the small things that keep your world running, and curious about the vast ones that do not obey our clocks. Carry tonight's quiet as a small talisman. Practice patience, design generosity into your systems, and let wonder sit beside your worries. Let the silence be a blanket that comforts rather than a shroud that frightens. Let your dreams be of small lights reappearing in the dark, one by one, as if each were a star regaining its voice. Rest now. In the morning, the networks will hum and the telescopes will make new measures, and life will continue kinder, perhaps wiser, perhaps, still under the same grand, unblinking sky. Tomorrow, the world will speak again. Tonight, let silence teach us.